welcome everyone to Game 5 review of the World Chess Championships, which saw Gukesh with the white pieces versus Ding Liren with the black pieces. And, well, let's dive right in. Instead of the earlier d4 in round 3, which saw a bounce-back victory by Gukesh, he repeated pawn e4 on move 1, which was seen, of course, in round 1, where Ding Liren played the French defense with e6, and Ding ended up winning in a very interesting theoretical battle that, despite being well out of opening preparation by Ding and well in Gukesh's opening preparation, Gukesh went astray. Ding brought the goods and managed to win in the end in round 1. Let's see if that went any different. Today, we saw the main moves where white puts pawns in the center and black strikes right back. And instead of the advanced variation, we saw the exchange French of e takes d5, e takes d5. And, well, there's a few things on this. This is very symmetrical. Pawn islands of 3 on the king side, and of course 4 each completely symmetrically and identically on the queen side. And as a result, there's one open file, and on the one hand, it gives white little risk. On the other hand, it gives black little risk as well. So an interesting choice, however, a very relatively trendy one in recent years, where there's a lot under the surface that can really become quite imbalanced. Let's see what happened. Knight f3, knight f6, with only a minimal amount of thought on this moment. 90 seconds for Ding just to consider, does he play knight f6, bishop d6, trying to remember his notes on such an opening, the exchange French. So knight f6 was chosen. Bishop d3, a very logical move. Play certainly could continue, bishop d6. Both sides could castle, and it's very symmetrical, almost copying one another. And because white holds the first tempo, at some point black will have to diverge from copying. However, Ding did just that right now. Pawn c5. And, well, the main point is to try to imbalance the structure. Firstly, this invites white to play d takes c5 potentially, or at the very least c takes d4 in some positions, leaving the relatively permanent structural feature of the isolated queen's pawn, or the Isolani pawn, the IQP. And after, let's say this, which it should be noted, this has helped black's bishop, so usually white won't be taking too much, although it does happen. Now, black has the isolated queen's pawn, which can be a long-term weakness in, for example, a queen endgame or a rook endgame, or even a single minor piece endgame. This pawn could be left on its own with issues. There's no black pawn defending it. And as a result, if black doesn't have pieces to defend it, or indeed has to tether their pieces to the defense of it, then in the long run it could become weak. On the other hand, the positive for it is that because these two pawns have disappeared from c7 and e6, there's a lot of space behind it and around it. And usually that benefits the side with the IQP when there's more minor pieces on the board. The general rule is if there's 4 minor pieces, you're probably doing quite well. If there's 3, it's okay or good, but there's still a lot of potential attack. And then basically the fewer you get, so if it's 2 or 1, then there's a bit of a risk that, as I just mentioned, the squares around it can't be used as much to gain an attack against, for example, the king side. And meanwhile, white can gang up against it. Very early days, and indeed this did not happen, but this signposted that Ding was very okay with this potential imbalanced game. As it was, as many others have done as well, Gukesh simply played c3 to solidify, not helping this bishop come to here, and saying if you take here, much like the bishop being helped to c5, the knight is helped to d4, and of course it's quite a good knight attacking forwards and blockading the d5 pawn, showing that, well, it's also in the way of black's pieces as much as it's got out of the way of other pieces, for example, knight c6 and such. In any case, Ding Liren played c4. The bishop retreated to c2, keeping its eye on the king side. And now bishop d6. And it's worth noting that at this moment, this was following the game Nakamura Abasov from earlier this year in April in the Candidates tournament, where Nakamura with white castled their king and kept the queens on unlike as we'll see in today's game. And the game was eventually a win for Nakamura with white. However, not necessarily as a result of the opening. As we can see here, black started, as we'll see in the next few moves, fighting for an initiative on the queen side, clearly going for c3. But the ultimate problem was that there's so many pieces on the board. A lot of them for white are targeted at the king side, which by its very nature, this gets checkmate. This might weaken a pawn. They may be even able to win the pawn in the long run, although that is black's problem. It's very hard to attack this pawn and take several moves, at least 3, to even get close to destabilizing this. And of course, there are issues with doing that. And in that time, after the development of the knight, the queen coming to f3 just starts to get an immediate initiative against this king. And, well, ultimately, with this pawn being a little bit weak, with this king side being tender, Nakamura went on to win against Abasov in the Candidates tournament from April of 2024. If we backtrack to the game in question, instead of castles, Queen e2 was played, semi-forcing Queen e7, because if bishop to e7, then just castles, and white's got a much improved version of everything we just saw in the Nakamura game. And if bishop e6 block, immediately knight g5. Black might well be able to hold the fort and survive, but that's not a very good indictment of the opening. In a nutshell, after a move like queen d7 or queen c8, we'll go with c8, the queens likely trade off, and this is known as a backwards pawn. They can never really play e5 now. It's going to be a constant weakness. If e5 immediately, you've left your king in the center, you're opening up the center. That cannot be a good idea. White simply captures, bishop captures, rook e1, and you can defend all you like. Simply attack the pinned piece once more. And even with all of these pieces undeveloped, well, the bishops at least can move and the knight's very quickly coming out. But in the meantime, the piece that is developed wins the day and wins a minor piece. As a result, that is simply not possible. We cannot block with the bishop on e6 for this reason, which fixes the weakness. So queen e7 was played, and, well, the idea here, as was definitely in the notes of especially Gukesh, was, as he then chose to do, to capture. And king takes slightly perplexed Gukesh. Most of his notes, as he later said in the press conference, were with bishop takes e7, where various things could be tried. The bishop could come to f4 at some point, or still to g5. Castle's kingside would have happened, and after rook e1, because of the asymmetry with white getting the open file first, Gukesh and his team clearly would have felt pretty happy here. Ding would have not been unhappy, but there's definitely some play here with more central control, and because this pawn's come to c4, it does mean there's less pressure on d4. This is the base of the pawn chain, the weakness. There's no counter-strike now against the front of the pawn chain. So this is the weak point in white's position. A little bit harder for black to get, whereas d5, as you saw in the Abasov and Nakamura game, possibly is a little bit closer to white's pieces, and so that much more easy to attack. I'm talking very, very small margins, but that would be a possible weakness, counter-weakness sort of trade-off. However, after king takes e7, Gukesh thought for 3 minutes and castled, trying to think through, does he pin? Does he sink a knight in on e5 before the knight comes in here? But no, castled makes a lot of sense, getting ready to do exactly what we just saw in a slightly different position. And then after rook e8, rook e1, king f8, we're in a very similar position to what we just saw, except the king's on f8, and now there's a bit of tension on the e-file, and perhaps for that reason king takes e7 enables black to get the rook here. Sometimes castling by hand can be the best way. And here saw a relatively forced trade of rooks. If white declines, then rook e2. That's not very good, allowing the rook to the second rank. If white leaves it, then, well, join the club. Both rooks will be traded, and the knight can come to c6. And the open file for white is only useful if he can use it, and he certainly cannot. And black is probably the one getting the rook there first now. Combine, or going back even, to this moment, for that reason, Rook takes e8. King takes e8 even. Knight takes is completely unnecessary. It's defending the pawn, and for one thing, it blunders this pawn. It's worth noting that this gets very risky if you try and trap with moves like bishop h6. And this is not a nice pin, and after a move like h4, with h5 coming, knight g5's, knight coming out, these bishops are totally safe. Yeah, white has won a pawn, and could well convert such a scenario. Still relatively level because this bishop is trapped, but white's bishop is in no peril, and it's probably going to escape when this pawn gives a get out of jail free card. In any case, coming back to here, king takes was what Ding Liren played, and Gukesh brought that bishop out. And this is perhaps Gukesh's point, that after knight b d7 defending, of course this is no longer an issue. Now it's defended, it's not pinned at all. Knight b d2, and white is slightly hand development with more central play, and the same base point of the pawn chains is slightly imbalanced. This pawn is possibly more accessible to white than b2 is to black, and this is quite far away from happening. And indeed, as we'll see, doesn't really happen throughout the whole game. h6 was played, just tucking it off of the h7 square, and also posing the question to this bishop. And after bishop h4, knight h5, a very interesting move. Taking the fight to to Gukesh, perhaps coming to f4, attacking some squares. There is the common motif, a knight on f4 attacking g2 and a knight on f5 attacking g7 for white. Both of these moves are pretty useful, and this could be quite an offensive gesture. Of course, g3 would immediately lose, so you can't stop it because you lose h4. Meanwhile, rook to a check then happened, king to f8, and at this point, feel free to pause the video. It's not necessarily a tactical blow, but a strategical moment where have a think what you would play in this moment. It's really interesting, all the different plans that white can go for. There's knight f1, there's even b3 starting to strike here. It would probably provoke b5, which is definitely something worth considering. And even knight e5 is possible, trying to invite black to trap their knight on f6, knight from f6. The problem is f4 is now very accessible, and after the bishop moves, this pawn is just sticking out like a sore thumb. Very hard to move, and black would be almost preferable here with a lovely bishop versus this not so lovely bishop, very trapped in a bad bishop. If you found Gukesh's move, well done. It was in fact g4, launching forwards with their kingside pawns. Very interesting move, putting the question to this knight. There's only two squares it can move to, and Ding chose f4. If back to f6, perhaps knight e5 now comes with a slight tempo, because now if captures, you can't take like this, the pawn would fork. And of course, if the bishop takes, then what was a lovely bishop on c5 is not there at all now. The pawn here does drop, but there's definite compensation with these pieces still unable to move, and with these having pushed forwards, well, white has compensation for the pawn in the form of e6 breaks in the long run, or indeed very, very quickly. It's very hard to stop them. Knight b6, for example, then just h3. The knight is trapped. Black has to play h5, and after e6, well, we see here that there's a lot of weaknesses in black's position because these are still undeveloped, and this is now accessible to white. We're seeing that will allow them to win d5 back with a lot of interest in the form of targets on h5 and various squares around the king. And the bishop pair, it's worth noting, could threaten some very major mate threats. Instead of that, Ding came to f4, hopping forwards, hoping to probe the weaknesses left behind from launching forwards like this. Even d3 could be a nice outpost, as we'll see. And there followed bishop g3, a very sensible move, pinning to the undefended bishop, which just immobilizes this. These checks come at the cost that it has to go back with the check, and perhaps king h1 in some positions could avoid a further check. There, however, does come, as we'll see in another line. G5, locking down here. And this is a possibility. In fact, we'll just go back because at this moment, G5 is possible in the first instance. Very similar, just with the king from H1 to G1, and certainly this helps white a little bit more. White doesn't need to make the inaccuracy of going here. So G5 could have been an attempt at some positional chess. The downside might be that knight F1 reroutes the knight here. Once again, this is a more accessible weakness until this bishop can get to E6 comfortably. It can't even get there right now, and potentially can't get there too comfortably in any case. And this knight to F5 could be a bit of an annoyance. The good thing is black has activity. The knight now comes to F6, defends, attacks. And after knight E3, well, there's some interesting tactics. First of all, if knight takes the natural looking move, then white can actually capture on D5 and exploit this pin. And, well, of course, this is not really playable because not only do we win back the piece having won the pawn, but the rook now invades, and this is just terminal, in fact, with the bishop pair coming in as well after the natural B6. There's too many checks coming in to the black camp. This is checkmate if it were to capture. That's mate in 1. Very nice little checkmate in the center of the board. And if not capture, then knight is there to stay, and various issues will be happening, as we can imagine. In any case, if we go back to this moment, knight takes D5, too hot to handle. B5 is playable to get developed to avoid what we just saw, but this starts to get into a very, very grotty position for black, where white has a protected passed pawn. Black is blockading it, but this rook is still very, very active. Meanwhile, this pawn a bit overextended. White's hugely advantageous, and this is why the bishop has a lot to attack at. This pawn's a bit overextended. Black might hold on for a draw, but this is not pleasant at all. For these reasons, I wanted to show this moment back here, where after knight F1, knight F6, they can't, of course, as we said, take with the knight. They need to defend D5. And after bishop takes, knight takes, there's a very computeresque variation, H4, trying to dislodge the outpost, where black should just develop their king, and it's a roughly level game. We can't, as white, use these squares, so the king can step up, defend their pawn structure, and return the pawn, essentially, in a lot of lines. Almost to white's detriment. Black maintains this, can play various knight E3 moves and so on, so because of the time it takes to capture the pawn back. If black tries to play F6, which does weaken some light squares, there's a very, very computeresque H5 using the pin. Remarkably, after F5, the human move is to capture the pawn, and white would be somewhat better. But can you find a very, very computeresque move? Feel free to pause the video. That definitely wins on style points. Well, if you found it, the answer is rook E6. Well, in a moment we'll look at if it's captured. If it isn't, everything starts to drop with this knight going. There's just too many weaknesses, and of course the moment you start invading the space, well, this is going to be very, very bad for black for various reasons. All these pawns are going to start to crumble. That's before you get to the pieces. So captures is of course a critical line, and it revolves around this bishop dropping. Now firstly, this is the critical idea. There is a fork here with two undefended pieces in a moment. So if king F7 to defend, the problem is that's nonetheless, after bishop takes F5, they can quickly attack this bishop, but it drops back to the A3 square. I love the outpost anchored on the square. And if they try to play knight F6, knight E5, a critical tempo in all lines. Our minor pieces work beautifully together. King G7 is forced. White would then win a second minor piece, and that would be a technical win for any seasoned grandmaster. There's too many weaknesses, and the two minor pieces, 2 is better than 1. For that reason, at this moment, King G7, avoiding any possible checks, would be the best line. And we see a very similar variation, except we don't have any checks. And after the best move, if we go to knight takes f2, because if we go back to f6, then this is captured and this knight isn't quite as active as it could be. It does win a pawn, but it would still be ultimately a win. And if knight takes f2, then perhaps this knight is slightly more active, still able to win this in some variations, and it has, of course, some targets. White's still significantly better, but it just shows what could have happened in this variation. Some absolutely fantastic tactics. If only Ding had gone for it with g5 earlier. We'll reverse back to the game for now. I really wanted to show this fantastic computer-esque rook e6. Put that on the board one more time. h5, f5, and rook e6. Just exploiting this pin. If it's not captured, then various things go wrong. The bishop actually moves back to safety, then simply captures. Perhaps bishop takes, and everything we just saw happens, but the rook is preserved. And if that happens, well, if you're in bad shape before as black, you're certainly in worse shape if there's a rook additionally helping in the attack. If we retract back to the game, Ding played knight to b6, defending as well, not committing their pawn. Clearly a very safety-first approach. There followed g5, striking at the pawn structure, but captures. Bishop d7 finally developing, and computers give this pretty much triple zeros, very, very level. The knight retreated back by Gukesh, maybe aiming for this square, trying to argue perhaps there's no b5 possibility anymore. This knight's in the way, a little bit, well, it could come to a4, of course. And after rook e8, knight e5, declining trades. Well, this is where things turned, or at least could have, because after bishop takes, Gukesh should have taken with the rook, and with the rooks traded off, this pawn's that much safer. Very likely the following line would have ensued. Both bishop a4 is possible, trying to instigate this with this knight coming to here. Of course, with the stepped in knight check first, otherwise in the variation without this, we just simply lose a knight. And so we would have seen this, but after king e2, yes, the knight's won a pawn, but perhaps this king getting to e3 gives white some counterplay. And this would have been roughly level, essentially, and it's worth noting knight e6 is possible, but then f4, g6, this is all very roughly level. The king would come in, the king can come in, the knight can come to a4, winning back the bishop pair, or at least trading off the knight for a bishop. If that wasn't captured, once again, the pawn would drop. And as a result, in this moment, when this happened, d takes e5, this keeps the rooks on, and well, a lot of the variations we just saw essentially ended in opposite coloured bishop endings, where ultimately they're very drawish very often because bishops of opposite colours cannot attack one another. But when you keep rooks on, as we'll see, that leaves chances for both sides. But in this case, after knight d3, it's briefly doubling the pawns, but because it gives black avenues for attack, well, very rapidly after f3, making way for the king, it's on dark squares, so makes a lot of sense with this bishop being unable to do anything. Well, now knight c4, simply too strong, and after captures, we have a protected passed pawn. Both knights have had to be captured by pawns. The d3 knight, just a few moves ago, was just simply too strong, an absolute octopus knight. X-raying forwards like this, and backwards indeed. And then this knight, if we just go forwards to this moment, also very, very strong. An absolute unit hitting forwards. So after captures, all of a sudden this pawn takes here. If this was just a bishop ending, there'd be very little worry for Gukesh. The king would sit on e3 and they'd probably draw it out relatively quickly. Not always drawn, but they have tendencies to be. But with the rooks on, Gukesh lifted the rook very sensibly, hoping to attack the pawn, maybe get to d4. Rook's behind the passed pawn makes a lot of sense in endgames, because from here it can do all the things forwards and sideways potentially, and monitor it. Of course, the king will help somewhere, probably e3. But the point is, it's a good move. And had Ding played bishop e6, well, there would have followed rook d4, very likely rook c8, with the idea that we're covering the pawn. This is a cemented, protected passed pawn. Perhaps bishop f2, rook up to c6. Ignoring this check, it's not too worrisome. And white would, with best play, very likely hold the draw, but it would have been very uncomfortable with this constantly being a threat. There's only one dark square, and if the bishop's forced to be a blockader, then there's other issues. Of course, there's still b5, a5, b4 ideas in some positions, where it's not out of the realm's possibility that if a3 is eventually achieved, then obviously this could run through. Definitely something Ding, and dare I say, if Magnus Carlsen had been in black's shoes, potentially there would have been a grind on our hands. However, instead, back here at this moment of bishop e6, bishop c6 was attempted. And Ding later clarified this was a tacit draw offer, in the sense, of course, they can't offer draws before move 40. They're on move 27 right now. But this move, firstly, this cannot be captured. There is a trick attached to it, because rook d8 essentially forces this pawn through. The best move is literally bishop e1, and Ding would certainly convert to piece up position. On top of that, he has all the play in the world with weaknesses to strike at. So that's not playable. So rook d4 was forced. But now c4 often drops, and even when it doesn't, this rook, a little bit improved, and the king gets a critical tempo. So now in all the variations, this rook can leave somewhere, and this king is that much closer to help out. And perhaps after bishop h5, king e3, b5, b3, rook c8, black is still better, but certainly in the other variation, this king was a bit further away. Now all of white's pieces are all hands on deck helping out, and with best play this would very likely be a draw. There's some rook h4 ideas, but ultimately, and the bishop cannot move for skewer reasons, but g6 would have been very solid, and ultimately this would be not trivial, but certainly a draw, much more comfortable than prior. However, if we go back to this moment, rather than bishop h5, Ding retreated to c6, clearly doubling down on his tacit draw offer, and after rook takes c4, now again rook d8, the king is there to help, so rook d4 is possible, and of course, well, firstly is check, secondly, if we do that correctly and capture first, this pawn is never running, and this is roughly what happens. Because it's an opposite-colored bishop endgame and the rooks have now been traded off, ultimately that means that black simply blockades, the bishop attacks the white squares, and both sides acquiesced to a draw. They played the next few moves, several moves in fact, to get to a threefold possibility, and on move 40 they agreed a draw, but also had made a threefold repetition, like this. And, well, a peaceful end to game 5. There were definitely a few missed chances back at around this moment here, where had Ding played bishop e6, holding onto the pawn, leaving this king a bit further away, more rapidly able to play rook to c8, and as we saw, potentially this could have given something. If king comes in, then rook to c5, and it's very hard to get the bishop, and of course if you play f4, there's 1,000 different reasons this could... It's very hard to prevent a passed pawn that's protected and protect all of your pieces. That's the point. This is a huge distraction. Meanwhile, black can have a play over here, and in this position, suddenly it would be very, very good for black. If you ever play this move anyway. You need to play something like b3 and try and liquidate the pawns. Of course, if this trades off, black perhaps doesn't have as many chances to win. as in when you allow them to keep play on and attack some pawns. So there's definitely chances to draw. Still very good for black, but some chances with rook lifts, defending pawns, and this is a huge, huge, huge distraction. Instead, at this moment, of course, Ding basically offered a draw, and he got his wish 10 or a dozen or so moves later. With black, a very sensible approach perhaps, but possibly showing, well, some safety first approach that, let's see if it works out. So a draw around 5, 2.5, 2.5 between Gukesh Domaraju and Ding Liran. Let's see what day 6 brings for us. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Cheers.